Moving into section 7.5 on bone growth and bone remodeling. Here are your learning objectives. And we'll begin by discussing interstitial growth of bone. Now we talked about interstitial growth of cartilage, and remember that was assisting in the growing in length of cartilage. And it is going to serve the same purpose here, except it is to bone. So interstitial growth is the growth that is going to take place at the epiphyseal plate in order to allow bone to lengthen. We do have cartilage in this epiphyseal plate, which is going to allow for that growth to take place. And so in these regions, we have 5 different zones that will allow the bone ossification to take place and get that bone to lengthen. So our first zone is the zone of resting cartilage. So that is going to be the side closest to the epiphysis, and this is going to include small chondrocytes. So you can see there are these specks right in here, and they're distributed throughout this matrix, this cartilage matrix. It does resemble mature hyaline cartilage, and it secures the epiphysis to the epiphyseal plate. Our next zone is the zone of proliferating cartilage, and this is where the chondrocytes are going to start to undergo rapid meiotic division. So this section always reminds me of stacks of pancakes because they're so rapidly going through cellular division that they are just stacked right on top of each other. So they align into these longitudinal columns of these flattened lacunae. And then our third zone is called the zone of hypertrophic cartilage. Here these chondrocytes start to stop their meiotic dividing, and they are going to begin to have hypertrophy. So they're going to become larger in size. You can see the size of them down here compared to zone 3 where they're much larger. And also the walls of these lacunae are going to become thinner. Zone 4 will be our zone of calcified cartilage. This is going to be about 2 to 3 layers of chondrocytes, and our minerals are going to be deposited between columns of lacunae, and it starts to destroy the chondrocytes here. Now we want those chondrocytes to die because that allows zone 5, our zone of ossification, to take place. Our walls are going to break down between the lacunae and those columns, and the spaces are invaded by capillaries, which bring in those osteoprogenitor cells that can turn into osteoblasts and build bone. And so that new bone matrix is going to be deposited on the calcified cartilage matrix. So that growth that takes place in length is going to specifically occur within zone 2 and zone 3 that we discussed, and that pushes the zone of resting cartilage toward the epiphysis. So here's a photo of our young bone, and this is of the femur, and we actually have 2 epiphyseal plates here in young bone, and then you could see this one is of adult bone. So that plate is then eventually going to become that this epiphyseal plate is going to then turn into an epiphyseal line. So during childhood, the plate is going to maintain the thickness, and then at maturity, the rate of cartilage production is going to start to slow down. So like I mentioned, we will have this remnant of this thin line, and this is made up of compact bone. Just a little clinical view for you on forensic anthropology. When we look at juvenile skeleton with separate diaphysis and epiphysis, it can really be a clue as to what age a skeleton is. Whereas when we find those epiphyseal lines, we know that it's an adult skeleton because it's a whole fused bone. We can also take a look at some of the areas of the bone, such as the epiphyses and the diaphyses or other structures surrounding it. If we have an open view, then it's going to be that no union is taking place between the epiphyses and the other portion of the bone. You can also see this over here. This just happens to be of a fracture and how they would describe it. We also have partial union, in which we see a little bit of fusion between the epiphysis and the rest of the bone. So here's another fracture depicting that. And then we have a complete union where all of the visible aspects are going to be united to the rest of the bone. And we see that female epiphyseal plates fuse about 1 to 2 years earlier than males. Oh, and also I wanted to draw your attention to some other differences we might see within the area of the skeleton, such as looking at skulls of males and females. Other areas we can look at to see gender differences would be their pelvis. And we'll get into that more in Chapter 8. Now for appositional bone growth, which is going to allow the bone to grow in width or widen rather. And this is going to occur within the periosteum. Remember, that was the tissue that surrounds our bone, and our bone matrix deposited within layers parallel to the surface of our bone. And our osteoclasts are going to work to resorb the bone matrix along the medullary cavity. So here we could see the width of bone in an infant. And then as we start to build bone on the outside by the periosteum, remember that intercellular layer? And we're going to use osteoclasts to eat away the bone on the inner surface. We'll see that that bone width is going to widen as we move into adulthood. Now for another clinical view on achondroplastic dwarfism. Achondroplasia is characterized by abnormal conversion of hyaline cartilage to bone. So the most common type is this achondroplastic dwarfism. Here we're going to see that the long bones of the limbs stop growing in childhood, and other bones will continue normally as they grow. We'll see that people that suffer from this are short in stature but have a large head, and it results from failure of the chondrocytes within the epiphyseal plate to grow and enlarge, and they have inadequate endochondral ossification. Now for bone remodeling. This is going to continue throughout adulthood. Your bone is constantly remodeling itself, and it occurs at the periosteal and endosteal surfaces of bone. So kind of similar to that appositional growth that was taking place in those same regions. They are going to occur at different rates. We'll see that the distal part of the femur, for example, is replaced every 4 to 6 months, whereas the diaphysis of the femur are not completely replaced over a lifetime. So 20% of our skeleton is going to be replaced yearly, and it's dependent upon the coordinated activities of our osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. And of course, it's influenced by hormones and mechanical stresses. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the other influences. But before we do that, let's take a look at this photo here. This is like your bone in a resting state, and then our body gets a signal to eat away at the bone, so the osteoclast comes in and resorbs the bone. And then we have our mononuclear cell that will allow our osteoblasts to start forming bone and mineralize, and we have our new bone that has been created. Now let's talk about hormones and mechanical stress, starting with mechanical stress. This is going to occur in our weight-bearing movement and our exercises that we do, and it is required for normal bone remodeling. We have our osteocytes that are going to detect mechanical stress within the bone and communicate that to our osteoblasts so that they know that maybe they need to secrete more osteoid, more bone matrix. And so this can help to increase our bone mass, especially if we have more weight-bearing activities. And then we can also have decreased bone mass where we have a removal of mechanical stress. So for instance, if you are an astronaut and traveling to space where you don't have gravity, and so you don't have that mechanical stress being placed onto your bones, you would start to decrease bone mass. So astronauts have to do certain exercises in order to maintain their bone density. Now for the hormones. These are going to be molecules released from one cell into the blood, and it will travel throughout the body to affect our cells. And these hormones will bind to cellular receptors of specific cells. And we'll talk about that process when we discuss the endocrine system. By binding to these specific cells, we're going to initiate specific cellular changes, and some are going to alter the rates of chondrocyte, osteoblast, and osteoclast activity, and will affect the bone composition and growth patterns. So the first hormone we'll discuss is the growth hormone. This is also known as somatotropin, and it is produced by the anterior pituitary gland. So we find the pituitary gland with coming off of the cerebrum, and it is known as the master gland because it's going to secrete so many hormones. Once it releases that growth hormone, it'll travel over to the liver and produce the hormone known as somatomedin. Both are going to be able to stimulate growth of cartilage in the epiphyseal plate, and the growth hormone will also trigger muscle growth and, of course, our overall bone growth. And then we have our thyroid hormone. This is secreted from the thyroid gland, which we find within the neck region, just anterior to your larynx, and it's going to influence the basal metabolic rate of our bone cells. So in turn, it's going to regulate normal activity at those epiphyseal plates. And now for the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. We know that during puberty, we are going to secrete large amounts of these hormones that'll dramatically accelerate the bone growth. So you can see here is one for most males, and here is the line for most females. We see increased rate of cartilage growth and bone formation within that epiphyseal plate, of course, and then the bone formation rate is greater than cartilage growth. But eventually cartilage will be replaced with bone, and at that point the growth is going to stop and kind of level off, and then we are going to start to see a decrease within bone mass as we age. And for women it's a bit more severe. Once they hit menopause and start to lose that estrogen, we see a steeper drop here within the curve as they age. And then we have our glucocorticoids. This is a group of steroid hormones that'll be released from the adrenal cortex, from the adrenal glands. So let me explain what this complicated photo looks like. Our hypothalamus over here, that's above the pituitary gland, is going to release something known as corticotropin releasing hormone. You don't have to know that. And then from the anterior pituitary gland, we have a hormone released, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, you don't have to know that. That then travels over to the adrenal gland. So here's where you need to focus again. Your adrenal gland has an adrenal cortex that's on the outside, and then the inner portion is called the adrenal medulla. So it's the periphery, the outside of the adrenal gland, that at the adrenal cortex, that we release glucocorticoids. And these are going to regulate our blood glucose level and also our high amounts of increased bone loss. So it'll impair growth at the epiphyseal plate in children, and we have to monitor if the children is receiving high doses of glucocorticoids, such as in children who suffer from asthma. Next, we have the hormone serotonin. This is a neurotransmitter as well as a hormone, and most of our bones have serotonin receptors. It plays a role in the rate and regulation of normal bone remodeling, and if the levels are too high, then the osteoprogenitor cells are prevented from differentiating into the osteoblasts, which we know are so important for building our bone. So you could see that taking place over here. Serotonin is secreted. The receptor hangs on to that serotonin, and we have a decreased osteoblast proliferation. And this could be linked to low bone density disorders.